Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for coming to this talk on Indigenous cultural intellectual property, Indigenous data sovereignty, and artificial intelligence with respect to particularly Southern African rock art, but also Australian rock art. So as per custom, I acknowledge that in Australia, I live on unceded Noongar and Whadjuk land, and also the various Kimberley people, Nikana, Balangara, Queenie, Winnewal, Gumbra, and others on whose land I work. In this picture, I've labeled, you'll see it has two labels, an image and a photographer, because it's quite a complex field, the visual field, and who owns what. So we want to try and get into it. As usual, we look closely at the rock art. So here you see Augustine Anunga, the traditional owner of an area in the Kimberley along the King George and the Drysdale River. If you look at that large macropod and you look closely, you'll see that it's actually been painted in a purpley color first and then been repainted. There's been maintenance by people as part of their obligation to what we might call images. At the tail of the macropod is a guion, or in the old language, Bradshaw figure, partially covered by mudwasp nests, which have helped us date that particular image to around about 13,000 years ago. And many, many other episodes from then up until recent times. Stencils are made right throughout the sequence. When we look at Southern Africa, here we have a copy of Stephen Townley Bassett's work. He's a copy of rock art. It is here at the Rock Art Research Institute where we are today, and it is kept there in trust. And it's interesting to think how you would acknowledge the people of Johannesburg, Egoli, in 5,000 years ago, for example, just one of those thought exercises. There are lots of people to thank, in particular today, the Rock Art Research Institute, and in particular Andrew Skinner for organizing the seminar, doing all the hard work. And then what I'm presenting is a combination of quite a number of different bits of research funded by various people over the years. Some of them know what they were funding, others have yet to find out. I just call it all a value add. It's all properly accounted for, not to worry. So who owns the past today? So this is a more complex question than one might think. And I played with it a little bit and then said, what about who owns, and inverted commas, pictures of the past today? Are those two the same thing? Is ownership even the right way to go about this? So there's a little roadmap for us today. I rather like Walter Benjamin and his notion of straying, if you like. My translation of that quote, which you can read for yourself, is that any idiot can use a map to find their way, but only the truly gifted can use a map to get lost. In other words, don't go down the established paths of knowledge, pioneer new ways in areas little explored. Of course, there is a danger to this, as Yogi Berra, or attributed to it, said, you've got to be very careful if you don't know where you're going, because you might not get there. Anyway, so maybe the roadmap will help today. After the slide, I'll have a little icebreaker exercise, get into the substantive part of the talk about the theoretical apparatus of who owns the past now, and then get into these particular instruments of intellectual property, cultural and indigenous property, copyright, data sovereignty, and artificial intelligence, before concluding and thinking, what does this mean for a decolonial agenda and possible third way that gets us out of the kind of conundrums and the mess we're in. I'll add that all the images in this talk have been cleared by the relevant Aboriginal and other corporations for use in the seminar, and that AI was used in the preparation of this, and I'll show you the slides towards the end. Questions are very welcome. It's meant to be a safe space. I myself recently found that I'm dyslexic, which I think explains a lot of the disquiet I've always felt between text and image, and this tension between talking or writing about those things we see and experience out in the field. All right, so as an icebreaker question, as a thought, have a think of what is your favorite archaeological picture? It must be a picture that you have in your head that you've seen somewhere. Maybe you've taken it yourself. Maybe someone else has taken it. I'll kick it off by showing one of my favorite pictures. So here's a picture. Just looking at the picture, and not knowing anything about it, you might not be able to glean much from it. Classic sort of David Lewis Williams gaze and guess characterization, rather than having some kind of insider's view. In this case, I am the insider, so I'm the one sitting up on the rock in days when I had hair. And then sitting next to me in order are Gail Emby, Carolyn Jennerat, Anne Holliday, David Lewis-Williams himself, Thomas Dowson at the bottom, and Jeff Blundell at the top. And it helps if you have a caption to your images. So this is in Camberg at Game Pass. You can just see the rock art at the top center, slightly left of center, around about 1990. This was a wonder. It was one of my favorite pictures. David took this unruly bunch of students at various levels of study and dedication to one of the premier rock art sites in the Drakensberg, and very generously shared his knowledge with us for a whole big long time. Always you've got to ask with things like this is who took the picture, because that's key often to questions of ownership. In this case, it's from a slide camera, a good old Pentax K1000, the AK-47 of cameras, and we just had it on a timer and then rushed around and took the photograph. So with those things in mind, you think, well, who owns this photo? It was my camera, so did I own the photo? David told me to take the picture, so did he own the photo? So these are the sort of questions to ask. In this case, under South African law, generally the person taking the photo is the owner of the photo unless they're different to the person who commissioned the shot. So wedding photographers, for example, don't automatically own their photographs. In some cases, they have to get a waiver from the person who's employing them or paying them, particularly around the reproduction rights, because they make their money not so much from the one-off photos they take at the wedding, but for the reorders they get. So in this case, David had commissioned the shot, and I was the one who'd set up the camera, although the camera operated itself, I suppose. So in this case, it's probably David who owns the picture. And if you want it back, David, I'm happy to send it to you. All right, let's get into the nitty-gritty. Heritage law I find very fascinating. I once did a course on heritage law in California, and one of the most interesting courses I've taken, a guy called Richard Cunningham, if you ever have the chance. But let's just go to first principles. So here in South Africa, the National Heritage Resources Act, about a quarter of a century old now and under review, but an important act at its time, and obviously still now because we have to obey this act. So it talks about the national estate, as you see over here, all of the heritage that is in Southern Africa that is of cultural significance and of value, as it says there, for the present community and for future generations. Interestingly, it doesn't really talk about the past that much. And then when we read on a little bit further, we find, in fact, this talk of a national estate, you'd sort of think that there's kind of national ownership of heritage, but no. All archaeological objects, paleontological material, and meteorites are the property of the state. And they might then delegate this to regulators like SARA, AMAFA, and so on. And then you can see the various other definitions of owner, site, and heritage resources. So in other words, and I know this having worked at National Museum in Bloemfontein and Iziko in Cape Town, that we hold things for the state, not even really in trust for the nation. That appears now and again, but is usually in a non-binding context. We also make some extraordinary claims that we will keep the stuff forever for people. It's a long time, forever. So are we even capable of honoring that promise? So whatever we might think of this, this is the heritage law, our heritage law that binds us all and all of our actions now today. And it leads us to some uncomfortable questions and thinking. For example, human remains, as they're often called, although I prefer to call them people, just because there's not all of them there necessarily doesn't diminish them as a person. But are people in the form of human remains, are they heritage resources or objects? And the answer very often, both in legislation and in accession policies, in museums and other repositories, is yes. They are the property of the state, just like a stone tool. If you want to get rid of that person, even through a good aim like repatriation, they have to be de-accession. They have to be unmade property of the state through advice from a particular council and then final approval of the minister. We also get controversies, such as the recent controversy, such as whether hominin fossils should be sent out into outer space or not. And the screen snip here shows two very different articles, one from Wits and one from academics. So the Wits one puts quite a positive spin on it, saying, well, we wouldn't be in space if it wasn't for those first steps taken by the Australopithecines and early Homo. Whereas leading archaeologists from SAPA, for example, have strongly objected to what they consider an irresponsible publicity stunt. For myself, I quite like it when things like this happen because it puts heritage in the public domain and gets people talking about what it might mean, what its value is, what it means to people. And a few years ago, there was SARA put out in one of their brochures, because of the definition of meteorites as of extraterrestrial origin, if an alien came to Earth, they would also be of extraterrestrial origin, and they might both need an import permit to get into South Africa, and if they wanted to leave, they might get an export permit. Just a bit of levity, but there are quite serious issues in play. So what about the rock art? So rock art, as defined in the Act, is any form of painting, engraving, or other graphic representation on a fixed rock surface or loose rock or stone, which was executed by human agency and which is older than 100 years, including any area within 10 meters of such a representation. This is a good definition, though it's interesting, and I'll present this towards the end, that bit about human agency, whereas in many Indigenous worldviews and knowledge, it's not humans who make rock art, it's other agencies, including what we call the rock art itself. So the name rock art is not an uncontested one, it's one that endlessly frustrates rock art researchers. Does this word, rock art, capture that thing out in the field? Should we rather use pictographs, petroglyphs, parietal paintings, or terrestrial engravings, and lots of other forms that people have? If there's a language name, that's the best to use, but we very often, in most cases, won't know what the language name might have been. In fact, sometimes, even if we do, there is no particular name for rock art, and we do need to ask who needs to know, or even what needs to know. So the screen snip at the bottom of the picture is from Science Direct, from the Elsevier stable, and here I stumbled across this definition of rock paintings. Rock paintings makes a global claim. It is at the bottom, you see AI generated based on space science and public engagement 2021. So interesting source that it takes it from. And then, as with AI, in this definition, there are some things that you'll say, yep, that's pretty accurate, and other things are a bit of a head scratcher. So it says rock paintings are defined as artistic expressions created by early sand hunters that convey their experiences, cultural narratives, and understanding of the cosmos, often found in the form of prehistoric artwork on the land they historically occupied. So it's a bit of a head scratcher in some ways. The early sand hunters, well, they're gathered as well, and there's a bit of a gender bias in there. Words like prehistoric, very problematic word. Everyone has history in one form or another. Everyone has archaeology in one form or another. This classic sort of distancing that it's all in the past and historically occupied rather than now. So an interesting conversation piece, but this is just some of the stuff that AI is throwing at us, and we also have to think, how does this play in a public domain with our students and so forth. The picture there is from the UK, just some, we might call it land art, and it would be interesting to consider whether that falls under the definition of art or not. Is it a graphic representation? All right, so these definitional deficiencies are linked to that question of who actually owns rock art in a legal sense. Whether you agree with it or not, in South Africa, the case is clear. It is owned by the state. But who has claims to the rock art? There could be many people who have claims to rock art. Khoisan, African farmers, their descendants. Southern Africa has lots of different kinds of rock art from lots of different kinds of groups, however you define them. And their descendants might have claims to rock art. People living near rock art, in no direct genetic or historical trajectory to that rock art, might still feel an affinity with that rock art. The nation with rock art at the center of its coat of arms could also be considered a stakeholder. So there are multiple claims to rock art. And then who should own rock art? So this more has to do with moral rights than legal rights. Is ethically, who are the best people to have claim ownership and stewardship even over the rock art? Law and ethics here, it's useful to make the distinction. I've made use of plurals, laws and ethics, particularly in colonial circumstances where countries have been colonized, stroke invaded by others, in South Africa and Australia's case by Britain, or the British Empire, if you like, is there's always more than one law. A law becomes imposed from the colonizer, including heritage laws, which has a genetic relationship, historical relationship to the early colonial laws. But those laws never, ever extinguish the existing indigenous or local laws about all sorts of things, including heritage. So there's always more than one law at play. Some legal systems, South Africa's included, allow for customary law, um, uh, um, but it's often seen as a lesser law, and the determining law is the imposed law. I think as social scientists entering the 21st century, we need to take seriously how to work with a plurality of legal systems, which can often contradict. This is also the case in ethics, for example, because ethics can exist at different levels: the personal, your own ethics; professional, for example, a SAPA code of ethics; and situation, the situation you find yourself in. And these can contradict each other. As an example, over about 5 or 8 years in the Kimberley in Northern Australia, we had a multi-partner rock art dating project. It was requested by, in this case, Balangara Aboriginal Corporation and traditional owners. And to do this, it involved a lot of geochronologists, archaeologists, other academics. We needed to take samples of the rock art. By the end of the project, we'd taken about 600 samples. It sounds a lot, but they're all really small. They all fit in a Ziploc bag, small Ziploc bag. Almost all the samples were taken by Indigenous rangers, for example, Balangara rangers. But before we could do that, we spent 2 or 3 years building up the relationship, actually 3 years building up the relationship with Balangara and the Kimberley Land Council. And then they gave us permission to go ahead. They said, yes, we like this project, go ahead. I then mentioned that this is in Australia, what is known as the Aboriginal Heritage Act. Somewhat confusingly, this one state has 3 heritage acts: Aboriginal Heritage Act, and Underwater Shipwrecks Act. There's a structural racism in them, in that the Heritage Act, which is largely colonial, and the Aboriginal Heritage Act, which is around Aboriginal heritage. There are different categories of contravention of the Act in each of those acts, the same categories, but they have different fines for the categories. So inadvertently, you are valuing or devaluing one kind of heritage more or less than the other. Anyway, but I then mentioned that under this act, we needed what's called a Section 16 permit to destructively remove pigment. Destructive, it's tiny pigments, but nonetheless, it's removing them. And we were very strongly met with opposition from the community, where a lot of people said, this is our land, and it's exclusive possession, native title land, and we give you permission to go ahead. And in fact, we don't want you to get the Section 16 permit. So this was a bit of a conundrum. I think this is where it's useful growing up in South Africa, where you're probably more inclined to kind of break or bend laws than people from many other places. In fact, I think this is a common global South type of thing. But we had a considered discussion, the other principal investigator of the project, Peter Veth, and myself, because we had a lot of people working on this project, including students, and we had to protect them. So they couldn't be guilty of any misconduct or illegality. I was prepared to break the law because I thought it would be ethical conduct. So my situation and my personal ethics said this would be ethical conduct. Professionally, I could have been had up at the Australian Archaeological Association for unethical conduct or unlawful conduct had we gone ahead. What saved us was one of the elders asked, what will happen if you don't get the Section 16? We said, well, we'll get into trouble. We can have misconduct findings against us, which we have to declare every time we ask for funding, or if you apply for a job, or all of those kinds of things. Said, no, we like you all. We like the project. We don't want that to happen. You go and get a permit from your government. She didn't say the government, our government, your government. So there are all sorts of issues of sovereignty and ownership that are tied up in here that I'll explore a bit further in the rock art, starting with ICIP, Indigenous Cultural and Intellectual Property, which is defined by Arts Law Australia, drawing from similar legal instruments internationally, as all aspects of Indigenous and, in fact, people's traditional knowledge and cultural expressions. So it's all cultural heritage. And the screen snip there is from RARI, from the database that is housed here at RARI through funding and years of work. Multiple people, organizations have put their rock art images on here for use for research, public education, all sorts of purposes. Just in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see 2025, the well-known copyright sign, the African Rock Art Digital Archive, all rights reserved. Now, what does all rights reserved mean? Well, from the Copyright Alliance, it's a statement used with a copyright notice to explicitly state the copyright holder retains all rights granted under copyright law, such as the right to reproduce, distribute, and modify their work. This declaration serves as a clear warning against unauthorized use and helps establish ownership of the intellectual property. It is a customary practice to signal vigilance in protecting creative works from infringement. So quite definite, hard language. It's a warning, it's protecting, it's putting barriers around who owns something and who doesn't own something, and a penalty of fees if you like. So this is not at all having a go at RARI. I'm a research associate of RARI. I've contributed to this database personally and professionally, for example. It's very common in things we deal with all the time, but perhaps we should now start rethinking other regimes of ownership, perhaps. And here are the full copyright terms of use. All images, documents, and text contained on this database are under the copyright of RARI at the University of the Witwatersrand and in each institute or member of the Sarada project, which is initially the Southern African Rock Art Database. And there they are all listed. So images may be viewed or downloaded only for private research purposes, studies, lectures, or seminars. So there's the usual, what we call fair use. If you're using it for a non-commercial purpose, they're available to you over there. Go for your life. But images may not be reproduced or duplicated without the written permission of RARI or Sarada. And for commercial purposes, the same thing, and there you apply and have an agreement form. Pretty standard all over the world, but the world is changing in terms of understanding copyright because of the Indigenous data sovereignty movement. So as you can see from the screen snip, lots of Indigenous people throughout the world have been the victims of parachute research, where people, non-Indigenous or for outsiders, have come in, they've done research, they've created data, and they've used that data for research, patents, scientific and commercial applications, and there's been very little or no sharing with the source community. So Arts Law Australia again talks about the inherent right of Indigenous people to govern the collection, ownership, access and control of data about their communities, cultures and knowledges. It seeks to restore control over data that has historically been exploited and to ensure data reflects Indigenous values, priorities and self-determination rather than colonial frameworks. So it's a pushback, it's assertion of sovereignty, it's stating or putting up front past abuses, if you like. So it's a challenge in many ways, a challenge that obviously comes with a great many issues. I think what's useful, so working in Australia, the term Indigenous is largely unproblematic. Some people prefer the term Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander, or First Nation. You find out what term people like, or the very specific group term people have for themselves, and then use it. And in Australia, you largely have a kind of non-Aboriginal Australians and Aboriginal Australians. About 5% of Australians identify as Aboriginal. But in Southern Africa, and indeed in lots of places in the global South, South America is another one, people don't tend to use the label Indigenous, largely because it's tied to the politics of marginality. South America and most of Africa, Indigenous by a number of definitions, lots of the governments in power would be of Indigenous people, but they don't feel the need to use Indigenous. In fact, they reject that term because it's associated with marginal groups who use the term to try and leverage extra rights, if you like. So I think here in Southern Africa, there could be some interesting thinking around copyright and assigning various forms of ICIP to people and groups. A little bit more about them later. Other issues, particularly under copyright law, Western copyright law, are individual versus communal ownership. So typically in a Western regime, copyright exists in a work for the life of its author, and it's usually one or maybe 2 or 3 authors, plus usually 50 or 60 years after their death, after which the work becomes public domain and can be used without any permissions, like we use Shakespeare, for example. And then there are often time limits, and in that there's also a time limitation, and you also saw that with the definition of rock art in Southern Africa. It's got to be 100 years old. So rock art made in the last 100 years is not covered. So just put that screen snip there again. So these are quite substantive issues to wade through, and it'll take, individuals have been grappling with this to some degree, but as a group of practitioners, social scientists, archaeologists, anthropologists, and so on, less so, though there were some early breakthroughs that I'll get to in a moment. And this brings about the sort of juxtaposition of the FAIR and CARE principles. So these are two distinct approaches. In broad terms, FAIR is, call it the researcher's approach, and CARE is the Indigenous person or Indigenous researcher's approach. So FAIR is really all about sort of open access. Open access is generally seen as a good thing, but under the CARE principles, a lot of Indigenous people say, in fact, data can be harmful. Is you think of an anthropologist in the 1930s writing down testimony from someone they've been working with, and then 50 years, 100 years later, those archives, those field notes get digitized. There could be really private and sensitive information in there that could cause descendants distress, and open access might not be such a good idea. Even in rock art research, we're very loath to give away site coordinates because we want to protect the sites against unauthorized access, most sites not having access control. So even within our own FAIR regime, we also put limitations on. We don't want everything to be open access. In FAIR, so findable and accessible, a lot of this is also geared towards machine learning. It wants to have knowledge available, easily accessible through different systems, interoperable and reusable in lots of different contexts by lots of different people. This doesn't always sit well with Indigenous groups who say there needs to be collective benefit, not just of the researchers, but of the source community. You get a lot of Indigenous researchers as well. There are all sorts of stakeholders associated with rock art and archaeology and heritage in general, and the benefit should be collective to them. Although authority to control the A part of CARE should be very clearly stipulated, and that includes a right to veto work, for example. And with that comes a duty of care or responsibility, and ethics come into play, so which will vary from case to case. So it's grounding those kind of large, free-floating, scientific kind of Western neoliberal values in the FAIR principles into something that's more of a care kind of grounding in a local circumstance. And together they can actually work quite well, although it takes willingness on both sides for this to happen. I digress now, or is a digression, rather a progression to artificial intelligence, large language learning modules, whatever you want to call them. So on this slide, this is from Adobe Firefly that can generate images from you. This is from a unit I teach on rock art. And last year, one of the tasks for students was to compare a known rock art, choose a rock art from a part of the world, a known rock art, and then have AI generate text and image on that rock art. In this case, the prompts were Southern African rock art, which produced the image on the left. The idea was the students would look at that image, juxtapose it with actual images of Southern African rock art, and say what AI got right and wrong. And in this case, it's gotten, other than the rock, it's probably got, which is actually really realistically rendered, it's gotten pretty much everything wrong. It's got a pretty bizarre sort of humanoidish kind of thing over there, a engraved face that doesn't belong anywhere in Africa, for example. And so we're not very happy with that one. Interestingly, I often I've asked before for AI to do put archaeologists to see if it catches up with the fact that archaeology these days in most places of the world is dominantly female and other genders, changing from a male-oriented discipline. And when you hear the other three images were on the prompt Southern African rock art researchers, it does have, a guy there who looks in a sort of slightly awkward bundle. But then it also has someone who looks sort of Indigenous, although possibly more South American, and female in both cases. So that's probably quite good. And I think we're at this interesting stage of AI development where it gives the good and the bad. It's very much a kind of curate's egg. The screen snip of the text you have there is from a pretty much today article, came out today, talking about multimodal literacies that are required. photographs, people these days generally know that photographs can be manipulated, that they're not always a one-to-one relationship with what's out there. The shot has been framed, it's been selected, commissioned, and all of those kinds of things. But with AI, how do we know where is all of this information coming from? We generally don't know the sources. It gets on a bit more. You might know the chair, the excavating a chair. So AI can now do video. Really, well, let me show this and then we can chat about it a bit. Oh, 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 sorry, a bit of word from our sponsors. Here we have archaeologists excavating a chair. And you could kind of laugh at there, look at the chair going along there and the sort of floating chair that kind of comes along. But at the same time, the human figures, the landscape are all very realistically rendered. And it's only a matter of time before you have a very seamless, that sort of serendipitously, if you look on the right-hand side, we might be a little buggered. Moving on, however, to some of the issues of AI is, beg your pardon, we'll just go back to that. Oh, I was going to show it again. Right, thank you. Let me just get out of that window. It really wants to show this one. I'm going to stop sharing and then I will get back into the presentation. Essentially, some of the issues with AI, other than disrupting one's talk, so that's what happens when you try and get clever, I suppose, is, oh, no, more sponsors, no thank you. Ah, there we go. I'll just strategically move beyond that one. And we recently had this case. You can just see an image over there. Agence France Presse got hold of me and asked, is this an actual painting of a Wandjina up in the Kimberley? And I said emphatically, no, it isn't. It's a fake, and gave various reasons for it. But it's all over social media, and it's all over social media, and people are making all sorts of claims of it, including aliens. So the aliens are with us again. And it's an exercise in how, or a challenge to how we communicate with non-academic audiences, for example. And I find one of the effective ways of communicating with them is to point out the costs of AI. So, for example, there's a gendered and participation cost, as you can see from the figures over there. It's largely a white male activity. It is environmentally unsound. Those 4 AI snips from the rock art unit, I no longer ask students to generate AI images because each image takes up to half a liter of water to make. This is to cool the data centers in which the data is kept, and also to run the machines that generate AI. It's also culturally appropriate and unsafe. It just crawls through everything in the internet. It doesn't respect any sort of copyright, whether it's indigenous or not. And importantly, we as academics or anyone doesn't know where the sources of those images or texts are. So we can't do good peer review, evaluate the veracity of the knowledge. There are some ethical AI databases. In other words, you have people who knowingly contribute their work to a database. Their work gets acknowledged, it gets sourced, and in some cases they get paid for that work. So there are ways to make AI not culturally appropriative and unsafe, but overwhelmingly at the moment, it's pretty much a sewer. And in universities are well behind in how to deal with it, how to give guidance to students and so on. And a field like rock art really lends itself to AI, both the good and the bad. So some of these issues in shot there, you have Terry Janke, Indigenous Australian lawyer, who is really into AI. I've got a link to her TEDx talk at the end of this presentation, but she says AI has no dreaming. It has no kinship, country, or cultural obligations. It doesn't understand cultural protocols about whether certain images come from places that need to be respected or whether it should make versions of them. And in the image there, you see what looks like a traditional Australian Aboriginal dot painting from the Central Desert, but it's all AI generated. What does rock art offer? If we go back to the rock art, are we talking about just an image? So in the shot there, I've got a depiction of a redrawing, so not the actual rock art, not a photograph of it, but a redrawing made from a tracing, so several generations removed, of a long serpent. A couple of weeks ago, I was up in the Richtersveld talking to various Nama people who live there, and they said the serpent, those lines from its mouth, not the one that's the forked tongue, are very much like the drade of the waterslang, the wires of the water snake that can catch people unawares. So it's a really good pan-Southern African metaphor, if you like, the serpent. This one is from near Excelsior in the Free State. If you've ever been there, it's probably one of the more exciting things to happen in Excelsior in the last few thousand years or so. But at the right-hand side, that stippled line indicates a crack in the rock. In other words, and there's no paint on the other side of the crack in the rock. So in other words, the serpent has been painted as though it's coming out of the rock. So this is classic Lewis Williams 101, Through the Veil, the notion that this isn't a depiction of a serpent from out here, that from an insider's point of view, from the artist's point of view, or the creator's point of view, it is a serpent from the spirit world behind the rock face that is coming out from the rock face into this world. In other words, it's not an image, it's a thing in itself. And that thing in itselfness is echoed in the screen snip of Kim Ackerman's Wandjina book, the Wandjina iconic image that you be very familiar with as you see the sort of representation of the rock art above the cloud. Equally, Wandjina Wungu people today who still make and renew Wandjina images don't consider them to be images. They consider them to be the Wandjina resting on the rock place, and they, as people, have a reciprocal duty of care to these Wandjina. So in both instances, these are not images, these are not inert, these are sentient beings, ancestral beings. And so this is something that might be hard for someone outside of that tradition to understand, but perhaps we can approach it a little bit through archaeological science. I often think of archaeology as a translation exercise where we're translating things both for ourselves and for non-Indigenous audiences. The rock art dating project I mentioned earlier, when I reported back to community on a 17,000-year-old rock painting we had dated, one of the traditional owners, Colin Morgan, who runs a tourism business, looked at me and he said, "We told you they were old." So he said, if that number 17,000, 5,300, whatever, makes you accept what we already know, great. So this picture maybe does the same kinds of things. So in the background, you can see some rock art in the Guian or Bradshaw style. It's within the sort of acid crust, if you like. The acid and rainwater is eating away at the rock. It's a very stable rock, very slowly eroding, but nonetheless over geological time gets eaten away. We know the Guyans are here around about 13,000 years old. But as part of this project, we also had geomicrobiologists, and they would look at the rock face and they would say the rock itself isn't static. There are all kinds of organisms, bacteria that fix iron and all of those kinds of things on the rock art. Thought of sensorially, it's quite busy. It's sort of moving at a microscale. And in certain pigments, particularly white pigments, there's a great deal of microbial and other activity. So not exactly the same as what San and Wandjina Wungu people are meaning about living entities, but perhaps not a million miles away either. So this is maybe where we start looking at that kind of third way, where two different worldviews come together, come into conversation, and come to an understanding. That what brings us to this discussion of decoloniality, for example. It's really difficult because these biases that we have, whether they come from imperial, colonial, or neoliberal times, or whatever other bias there is, they're often so natural to us that they appear invisible, and it takes quite a lot of effort to consider what this bias is. In archaeology, for example, we have lots of dating techniques, but that biases us to not actually theorizing time very well. In fact, I don't think we have dates. What we have is we have the technologies that produce a series of numbers, and we then have to translate those numbers into socially and archaeologically meaningful dates, depending on what it is that we're looking for. And so we need to then collaboratively find ways to come up with a better way of doing things, one that's more aware of itself, that's more reflexive, that doesn't get too caught up, though, in that reflexivity, but that is also contingent on whatever the context that you're working in. So there's Lachranzi's very useful diagram of this third space of a decolonized knowledge system in terms of how we have access to knowledge, how you go about getting that knowledge, and in the first place, what is the nature of that knowledge? So very similar to the CARE and IDaS and ICIP principles. So my awareness of this started out at Tykesburg in the Free State, a rock art national monument under the old National Monuments Act, one of, at the time, only 12 archaeological sites among about 3,000 other architectural national monuments, and amazing rock art found in the same year as Lascaux. I think probably better than Lascaux. That might be a biased view. What happened there is that a fence was put up by the Liguri family, who've been amazing custodians of that site over many years, visited by tourists, integrated into the local school system. And as a result, National Museum Bloemfontein, when Jannie Loubser and Gordon Lawrence were there, installed this boardwalk to sit on top of the archaeological deposit, have informative signboards to make sense of the rock art. Though it was fire treated, unfortunately, what happened is a severe bushfire. What we would today see as one of the early signs of climate change came around, and I had taken over from Jannie, and I had literally just come back from Australia on a research trip with Paul Tayson in 2000. There's Paul Tayson in shot, and that's what we were confronted with, the boardwalk and the spalled rock and the deformed rock face, if you like. We managed to put it back together over a period of years with their National Monuments Council, Jeanette Deacon being instrumental in this work. We put down sandstone instead of a boardwalk. In fact, that sandstone comes from Paul Lowenstein's house. Those of you who know will know that he was a collector of rock art. He removed rock art from the field in the 40s and 50s and put them in his house in Ladybrand. So we thought his house had fallen into disrepair. We thought it only appropriate that we cut up his house and put it in a rock shelter site. So ultimately there is a kind of cosmic justice. What then happened after fixing up the site was how to reopen it. And we thought, well, it would be nice if we had, more than nice, it would be good if we had someone descended from the makers of the art. Of course, we don't have the Maluti San with us today as a self-identified group, although more and more people are claiming Khoi and San and Khoi San ancestry. And in the lower photograph over there, you see on the right-hand side, Benny Khotshwane, Minister of Arts and Culture, Provincial Minister of Arts and Culture, and the main picture is Mario Mahongo Kun and Kwe, leader from Schmidtschrift, from the Schmidtschrift San brought from Angola and Namibia by the South African Defence Force and put into the Northern Cape. And I had asked Mario if he would open for us, and he graciously agreed to do so. There was some noise about, but he's not from that area, he's not those sort of sand. We say, well, yes, but what you ask yourself why that is. I just had last week the opportunity to chat to his family at Platfontein in the Northern Cape. 97% unemployment in Platfontein. So are there ways in which sites like this, developments like this, can assist people who have moral rights to it, if not direct genetic or historical rights? Because if we don't do this, we're then guilty of dissociative archaeologies, where the local authorship and agency is downplayed or displaced by competing claims of ownership. So, for example, South Africa's legislative claim of ownership that the rock art belongs to the state and not to any of the source communities, for example. This has a long history, well known to all social scientists, of well-trodden path. For example, the White Lady, the disassociation there was denying local authorship and bringing in exotic foreign authorship. That's all quite well known. What's more interesting is how the white lady fares in Namibia today and the various uses its image is put to, and the development of Brandberg Doris as a heritage site, including number claims of what archaeologists might understand as sand rock art, similar sorts of things in Zimbabwe, which has similar sort of nation-state claims on rock art, as does South Africa with its coat of arms. Over the years, having talked to various San in Southern Africa, Botswana, and Namibia about the coat of arms, the Linton figure with the penis removed and mirror imaged in a gesture of greeting, is the San I've spoken to have always said two things. They've said, number one, they're delighted that there is rock art at the center of the coat of arms. Ons dink dit is 'n heerlike ding en ons dink dit is 'n boodskap van versoening, a message of reconciliation. But they also say, no one asked us. No one asked us any sort of permission. You have a radical abstraction of what is a religious rock art into a coat of arms, for example. Same sort of thing with the Noxa logo that you see in the middle of the picture there, 1996, based on superimposed running figures in picket shelter in the Drakensberg. Sam Ramsamy then chose this, or the Noxa chose the symbol, and Sam Ramsamy said, these are possibly the earliest depictions of sport among people in the country. Don't know sand rock art and sport, certainly active people, but not competitive sport as we understand it. But you do understand why this was done. 1996, 2 years after election, you needed a symbol to unify the nation, and you could hardly use an ox wagon or an assegai or something like that. So people, I think, understood that and put up with it, although they became less patient with the coat of arms. And certainly when you have commercial uses like BJ's having very facile notions of rock art on their sugar containers to Africanize them, that's just insulting. The image on the far left are rock art copies from Stowe, 1870s copies made by Pierneef in the primary school hall in Vicksburg. So if ever in Vreesburg, and if you're ever in Vreesburg, it's actually on the high school grounds, but go into the primary school hall, and Pierneef in the 1920s, 1924 from memory, did a frieze of these around the hall. It actually fell off the scaffolding, hurt his back, but he and a number of other people, architects like Moerdijk and the Morensky building on Tuks campus, that is a precursor of the Voortrekker monument, but with a lot of indigenous symbols, represent an interesting moment in Afrikaner nationalism that was quite open and inclusive, but then rapidly closed down to become exclusive. But that's a story for another day. So to work towards the conclusion, how do we move forward in a Southern African circumstance rather than borrowing from elsewhere, but using it for Southern Africa? So one is, copies can be kept in trust. They don't have to be owned. One can reassign existing intellectual property and license or sub-license from source communities or entities, for example, recognizing their control over it. This is really important, but it takes quite a lot of, I suppose, bravery or overcoming institutional inertia. You often hear this phrase, digital repatriation, where what people have really done is they've made digital copies of images, photographs, texts, scans, whatnot, and they then have given these copies to a source community or a community with some kind of claim, moral, otherwise, over rock art or heritage, but they have retained intellectual property and ownership of that stuff. So it's not in fact a repatriation, it's just giving someone a digital copy. Repatriation is also signing over the rights and giving control over whatever that database is. And now lots of people want their heritage and culture, including rock art, to be known, but not necessarily all of it. Unfortunately, we have in existing databases, you can have tiered access. So you can have an open public access like a RARI does. It says everyone have a look, whichever images you want to use for fair use, have a look at it. This is part of a national and indeed global heritage as well. But then there might be things that are not good for open access, and you could then have tiered access to them so that you close down access and keep it for only certain groups of people. You've also got to ensure FPIC in all new projects, I think. I think projects need to be built differently, thinking more seriously about who all the stakeholders are. Of course, many people do this as a matter of course already in so-called Stone Age and Iron Age projects, actually less so in rock art projects. So there's probably a gap over there. FPIC standing for free, prior, and informed and continuing consent. So having a real dialogue with people and having them even as project partners. And then we can move right through to, so you draw up actual contracts that govern who will do what and how benefit will flow and those kinds of things. And then finally, you can have the take seriously the notion that rock art isn't just an image, but that in certain world understandings are living things, and recognize it as a living entity with rights. So the screen snip over there is of an article in the International Journal of Heritage Studies that's about to come out in the next few days, in fact, where you'll see the first author is Matawara River of Life. So this is work we're doing up in the Matawara Fitzroy River, 733 kilometers, lots of rock art and all sorts of other heritage along it. But Matawara is also an ancestral being. It is not just the river, it's an ancestral being, often manifest as a serpent, and it doesn't speak English and it needs various interlocutors. So the second author, Anne Polina, Professor Anne Polina, she's a Nikana woman and a very respected academic. She acts as that interlocutor, and then the rest of us come in and do various particular tasks. I do the rock art and some of the heritage stuff in that. But the first author is an International Journal of Heritage Studies, is ranked #1 in heritage studies as terms of a journal. This is not just some weird out there kind of journal. This is taking seriously the fact that there are more than or other than or non-human entities out there that we need to engage with. We do have lots of resources available to us. There's a link there to Terry Janke's True Tracks talk. It's about 40 minutes. It's got some really insightful things in. Some of it is more Australia specific, but it's useful to have a whirl as well. And I'd also have a nod here to, there are lots of nods. Mentioned Jeanette earlier. She's really humanized that database, the Lloyd and Bleak database, humanized the people there, and a lot of her work has involved directly or indirectly descendants. So we already have models from early on. And also the screen snip there, Yoram Usip and Roger Channels. Roger, Yoram from Namibia, and Roger, intellectual property lawyer, and I think he's a High Court judge now, something like that. But in 2004, they wrote this article about media and research contracts for the protection of San intellectual property. It didn't get a whole lot of traction. It was sort of, I think, selectively ignored. But it could be something that could be looked at more seriously again if we are wanting to be serious about decolonizing the way in which we work, maybe cosmopolitanizing it and finding a third way in which to go forward. There isn't time for the sort of activity, I'm afraid, but if there was, it would be an interesting, because these are often interesting to talk to someone else about it. It's hard to recognize bias on your own. Find a bias and ways in which to turn that bias around so that we equitably recognize and share Southern African rock arts in this case. And, considering those propositions there, whose authority does your proposition rest, who's going to benefit from your idea, could your idea cause any harms, and maybe a manifesto of image rights might be something useful to have. So on that note, I'll stop and take any questions, and thank you for your attention.